I'm doing a sermon today. I like the sermon that I had originally planned to preach today when I was preparing it, but I wanted to go back to Labor Day weekend, even though we have passed that time, because I'm going to do a sermon today, and I'm sure you're going to remember this over the next 2 years, that I'm doing the longest series of sermons that I've ever done in any congregation. That is, on every Labor Day weekend, I'm going to be preaching a different sermon in this series, and it's 3 parts. So, over 3 years, you're going to hear 3 different sermons. Today's title is Work Matters. Next Labor Day weekend, if a storm doesn't blow us away, I'll be saying that workers matter. And then 2 years from this past Labor Day weekend, I'll be preaching a sermon on wages matter. But by the time I get to next Labor Day weekend, you won't remember any of that. So many of us here today are retired. And we remember our days of work. That is outside the home work. Some of us who have retired still work. There's many chores to do. There's commitments we have made. There's stuff that needs to get done. And while we may have thought we retired, we find that life can be pretty taxing and pretty busy. That's okay, because as a society, if we're honest, we've got to say that we are obsessed by work in this country and have been throughout our history. Though the question of work and what it means, the question of this reality always scares generation to generation. In homage to Ken Burns' work that begins tonight, I thought, well, if I'm going to throw a verse into this sermon, I should do something from the countryside of music genre. And so I remembered this song from years ago that was a hit for the group called Alabama. And I love that opening verse. Something like, I'm in a hurry to get things done. Oh, I rush and life's no fun. All I really need to do is live and die. But I'm in a hurry and don't know why. Bad Alabama, but the verse stands. We are busy, and often we are busy because of perceived need to be about work. When I was in seminary, I may have shared this, but I'll share it again. That's the thing about not remembering. Some of you can't remember either. Trying to go to school. We had our first child, my first wife and I. She was working, but it hardly was enough to carry us. I was working as a youth minister at a county seat Baptist church north of the seminary, a little place called Lewisburg, North Carolina. I worked as a custodian later, because it was easier to get a steady job as a custodian than it was to make money as a youth director. But this particular Advent and Christmas season, I had the job at the church. Someone told me about a job in Crabtree Valley Mall where they paid money for somebody to dress up in a red suit and a white beard and have people sit on their laps telling him what they wanted. I applied for that job, and I got that job, and so from 6 until about 10 every night, I sat there letting children pull my beard, and sometimes I would feel moistening in my lap as they got all excited. That's not a job that's fun. I don't care what you may have heard. And then I got a job in the morning hours loading UPS trucks. That job was from about 4 in the morning till 8, and so I could get off and run and catch the classes at the end of the semester. And so the work schedule was pretty incredible. Go to classes, try to finish the afternoon classes to take care of whatever I needed to up in Lewisburg. If there was something going on with office hours with the youth, running back to the mall and getting dressed and getting off at about 10 and getting home at 10:30 and getting up about 3:15 and working for UPS loading trucks. I did that for about a week and a half, and one Saturday morning I woke up and I realized, whether it was physiology or psychology, I just couldn't move. I was at my limits. And I was young, and that had never happened to me before, and it was scary. I'd been raised with a work ethic that says you got to support your family, and you've got to do this, and you've got to do this, and you've got to do it right. It's one of those things that can grip our souls and dominate our inside interior life. Back when some of you were working outside the home, or perhaps even now when you go to a party, what is one of the first questions that you're asked when you meet somebody? So what do you do? What do you do? That's standard. And after all, why not? The average person will spend 150,000 plus hours of her or his life working. And so the preacher in the book of Ecclesiastes seems positive about what work is. Positive that it's a gift of God, just like drinking wine and eating good food. And I thought, as I read that passage any number of times, apparently the preacher never worked for some of the bosses I had early in life. But then again, and here's the thing, the boss only contributed at times to the bad working environment, not the essence of the work. In Genesis 1, we get this picture of a God at work every day, all day, and taking delight in the working process. In the second creation story, and there are two there, God makes a garden and gives the first earthling the responsibility of tilling the soil. Both creation and work are gifts from the holy. Work, according to the storyteller, has its own dignity. But consider, for instance, the Babylonian version of the creation narrative, the Enuma Elish. Marduk defeats a rival, splits the rival in half, and invites other gods to live there. Their response? No way. It's a mess in there. Too much work. Marduk replies, I will produce a lowly, primitive creature. Human shall be his or her name. And to her or him shall be charged the work so that the gods may have rest. So humans in this story are simply utilitarian additions to serve the gods. The Greeks are interesting because Zeus gives Pandora a jar because he's mad at Prometheus for stealing fire and give it to the humans. Says to Pandora, don't open it. Pandora opens it, and out comes death, disease, cats, and work. All the unpleasant things in life. Oh, did I say that? I guess it slipped out, Susie. I don't think cats was in there. That's just probably a... Some of you don't know that I had a conversation with Susie earlier this morning about work was bad. Our scriptures use many metaphors for God, focused upon God as a worker, a weaver, a potter, an architect. And later, Jesus was noted by those who were writing the gospel stories to be a day laborer, a tekton, as the Greek word for it. This was someone who worked with his or her hands, a builder or a stone cutter. Jesus was probably a stone cutter. Some pastors who like to kind of pour perfume on places that make them uncomfortable said, well, a carpenter it's a notable position. Well, that preacher may have insights that I don't have, but Sophocles' father was once named as a tekton, and Sophocles took great offense and said that his father was no such thing. A worker, somebody who had to toil for a living, had to work in a hard way with hands. Our story says that God is a worker, a creator, a collaborator, and all of that's good. But one problem often with work may best have been captured with Studs Terkel years ago when he wrote, "Jobs are not big enough for people." We fail at times to carry that image of the Spirit hovering over the chaos, waiting to form goodness out of the chaos and the mess. And we fail to see that work can and should be a call, a vocation, not an occupation. Martin Luther wrote a lot about this. This is why work so often fails to give people meaning. And all of us long for meaning. The millennials, by the way, and almost every poll that's been taken around this edge express their greatest fear of growing old, having lived a meaningless life. A call is not what we do for a living, but it's who we live for. If we begin to see God in the work, no matter how mundane it may seem, then we begin seeing work as that which God might have been doing with us. But we lose these noble thoughts about work because there is an injustice in our society about wages or the conditions of the workplace or inept supervisors or messed up systems. All of these aforementioned factors come into play in our mindsets because we're human. The question is, can we rise above the pettiness of those often running the system to find a way to excel at whatever we're doing and whatever we put our hand to it? Oftentimes, that's where meaning comes. I hate to say this, but in the 1970s, even having a large youth group, and by today's standards, having 36 senior high schoolers is a pretty good number of youth in a youth group. But it was the 70s, and so you were dealing with all kinds of stuff that people still deal with today. But it was a heavy drug culture, and I stayed incredibly busy with the pain of those youth and the way they chose to act out. And so when I was over there working as an assistant custodian at the church in Raleigh, I confess clean floors and a clean commode seemed to me to mean something, because it was hard to see what I was doing in the lives of those youth. Putting your hand to something, feeling that this is work that must be done, and there's nothing wrong with doing this kind of work. But our challenge is finding vocation and finding a fit. People often don't know our own gifts. They perceive too often that they have none. How often I've been in churches where people when we put out a call for nominating committee work, and people would say, oh, I don't have any, there's nothing I can do. Lauren and Joe Goleski could tell you that sometimes even having someone willing to come and hold the ladder is pretty important stuff to do around the church. People often, as I said, they assume that they have too few gifts. Sometimes we end up crossways in our vocation and misfitting because we don't take time to learn about the gifts and how they can be used. We're too busy rushing forward, finding an occupation that makes us money or gives us status. What if you're truly good at doing something and society says it's not worth much? Just because you live in a classist society that places worth on jobs arbitrarily, and we accept those judgments and spend our days miserable because we didn't achieve what we thought was expected of us, and we fail to bloom where we are. Years ago, and I'm not picking on NASCAR, it could just fill in the blank, anybody who works in entertainment and sports industry. But years ago, because I grew up in NASCAR country and Dale Earnhardt died a tragic death, and suddenly there wasn't any real Facebook, but there were calls and stuff popped up everywhere with people consoling folk who was a big fan of Dale Earnhardt. And I couldn't help but weigh in a church newsletter that while being a fan was okay and caring about somebody's death meant something, he made a lot of money doing what he loved. But there were school teachers and custodians and fast food waiters, people that bless us in small ways every day. And they're just as valuable, even if they have no notoriety or make very little money. In Brevard County, school teachers, we don't even think about it, but school teachers who didn't even have a contract when the new contract was coming up went into mediation and thought things were settled, and then somebody pulled the plug and says, no, it's not. Those teachers go to work every day. Some of them do work second jobs. No, they're not Aaron Rodgers for the Green Bay Packers, who has certain gifts. And no, they're not Queen Latifah or fill in the blank. But boy, they're pretty important to a society that we hope will find the center that holds us together. Why is it that we don't value work in general and some kinds of work in particular? Work is the place of the Spirit. And it can be our place of ministry, vocation. And I believe that. I know of a church in Louisville years ago who didn't just ordain deacons or pastors, but they ordained mechanics because people felt a call to use that gift to help people. They ordained farmers. I think Wendell Berry, who probably is not high on ordination, I think he would have loved that concept, though. People who grow the food and who work the soil, that it was a calling to do that. It matters to God what we do, how we work. Housework matters. Yard work matters. Parenting matters. Cooking matters. Maintenance work matters. Everything we put our hand to in collaboration with God is divine in some sense and matters. Who we are and what we do matters. Always has, always will. As you ponder what you're doing today and tomorrow, I pray that you will give thought, give thanks for what you've been called to do, and then do it well, with all your heart and soul and strength, for it matters. Amen.